Welcome all to Navigating Cyber Risk Quantification. We have a very interesting set of panelists who has a lot of experience in this field. And I'd like to go through a round of introduction, and then we will kick off the panel discussion. So over to you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, for joining this session.
Thank you. My name is Joachim Fritschi. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the GLS Group, worldwide operating logistic companies focusing mainly on parcels. Myself, I've been in the security world for 20 years, and over the last 10 years in CISO or comparable positions, working a lot around risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. Ram, over to you. If you can introduce yourself, please. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Joe. And my name is Ramadoss. I'm the System Senior Vice President for Privacy, Information Security, and Health IT Regulatory Compliance. And I work for a company called CommonSpirit Health. And I've been with healthcare for almost 10 years. And I'm part of the compliance group, but I work very closely with all the entire IT and security and different groups. Before joining healthcare, I was with telecom for about 10, 11 years. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Ram. Over to you, Tony. And again, thank you, Tony, for joining the session. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Tony Martin Vegue, and I'm a Senior Security Risk Engineer at Netflix. I've worked at several companies for the last 20 years building out quantitative risk programs. I am also a co-chair of the San Francisco chapter of the FAIR Institute and on the board of directors of the Society of Information Risk Analysts. And those are two orgs that are dedicated to advancing quantitative risk techniques and modeling.
Thank you, Tony. And last but not the least, James, if you can please introduce yourself. Again, thank you for joining this panel.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are in the world. And like Tony said, thank you for having me. My name's James Hanbury. I'm a senior manager in KPMG's cybersecurity practice in the UK. I've worked at KPMG for about 8 years, and I've spent probably 3 to 4 years sort of starting to do more and more in the CRQ space. And I now lead our cyber risk modeling and quantification service in the UK.
Excellent. Thank you and welcome all. So let's kick off the first set of discussion points. And I will invite Joe. Joe, you have been more than a decade having a working experience in cybersecurity at various enterprises from across industries like supply chain, telecom, travel, and tourism, and more likes. How organizations across all industries are using quantification techniques in measuring and prioritizing their cyber risk is something which we all are excited to know and learn from you. So over to you, Joe, if you can let us know how is this being, the quantification is getting adopted by various industries.
Yeah, thank you. I really had some let's say mixed experiences. I think cyber risk quantification has worked so far successfully, let's say in small lighthouse projects or small initiatives, but never on an organizational level, at least in the organizations I've worked for. And in my experience, that it really boils down to a lot of cultural aspects and a lot of times also to, let's say, lack of maturity of the security functions and the overall company when it comes to cyber risk. The problem is often that the risk processes itself within the company are not as mature. And when you're talking about cyber risk, especially if you want to quantify it, you need to involve the business a lot more than you do if you do qualitative risk assessments. And that means you have to have a common taxonomy, you have to have the involvement, the ownership of the business. And I think one of the big problems is people talk about cybersecurity, and a long time ago they talked about IT security, which is always pushing the risks into the IT department, basically. And essentially, if you want to do quantitative risk analysis and management, you need to involve the business for the impact quite a lot more. And that means they need to take the ownership, and that, of course, and need to be involved in judging impact and measuring that, or at least estimating it. And that really takes a big cultural step in most of the companies, and also requires a lot more resource commitment, both in the security departments, but also in the business itself. And so that has been one of the, let's say, big pushbacks I got in the companies I've worked for. And so it has never really worked on an organizational level. But I think overall it's the right approach. And as the security maturity grows in companies and the industry grows, I think it's definitely the right way to go.
Thank you, Joe. And that gives a very good perspective. Sorry, Ron, you wanted to say something, I guess?
Yeah, no, I agree with kind of a honest assessment of where we stand when it comes to the risk quantification. The adoption rate is pretty low. I think there maybe when I look at I represent healthcare here. Healthcare, when it comes to technology adoption, it's already like 5 or 6 years behind, but we are catching up very quickly. But if you look at the modeling and how companies are doing in terms of even across the industry, other than financial industry, the adoption rate is extremely low. And but what is really happening is the board, the executive leadership team, they've started questioning. Okay, we are spending X amount of dollars, and what is the return that we are getting, or when are we going to stop complaining that we have problems, or how do we say, for example, if we spend say $10 million on 2 or 3 projects, how do we go back to the board and say this has reduced these kind of risks? So it's a real challenge that's happening, and but one thing I would say, there is a huge evolution happening. People are definitely trying to pay more attention, and there is a lot of support happening from the overall cybersecurity perspective. But I think it's very important for the industry like healthcare to see what are the best practices that the other companies are doing, and how do we come up with some simplified model without really putting hours and hours of work in trying to develop this.
And that's an excellent comment. So thanks for that, Ram. So I think we'll go to James. So James, if you can let us know, with your lot of background here in KPMG and in cybersecurity, how do you see this field evolving in the modeling and the quantification space?
So I think people's understanding of where it plays a part in the organization and what decisions it can help to support is growing. In the sort of 3 to 4 years that I guess clients have started to ask these questions of us, I've seen that understanding grow. I think one of the sort of key lessons for me is that you don't have to boil the ocean, and you don't have to try and answer every possible question that cyber risk quantification can help you answer in the first instance. I think it's a really useful exercise up front before you even embark on trying to implement a capability in this area. It's a really useful exercise just to be really specific on what it is that you're looking for decision support on. Is it the optimization or prioritization of a cyber change portfolio? Is it helping to understand what controls contribute more than others to likelihood reduction? Is it to estimate potential cost savings, as was just mentioned? Perhaps it's even to sort of inform capital reserve requirements. I think you've just got to be really precise on what's the question you're actually looking to, or questions you're looking for this to help answer.
So that brings a very important topic, right? So first of all, whom are you addressing this question set for you? Is it for the IT department? Is it for the board of directors? And accordingly, you really have to tune yourself in terms of how you present or how do you really quantify and say the magnitude of the problem, right? At the end of the day, if you're trying to draw the attention of the board, and there has to be something measurable. They have to figure out, well, we'd like to see a progress over the period of time. Are we, the different ways of handling the risk? Are we actually mitigating the risk? Or do we want to transfer the risk? Or do we want to really buy insurance? Some actions to be taken. And then more importantly, when you're spending the dollars, and I think to your point, right? When you talk about ROI, how do you define the ROI? How much investment do you really need to make? I know in the banking sector, we know for market risk, operational risk, credit risk, you set aside certain capital, right? Because that's a requirement by the regulators that you have to set aside such a certain capital. And in order to do this capital requirement calculation, you are forced to measure it, right, and quantify it. And I think cyber risk is an evolving space, as Joe said, right? It's actually a lot of organizations are in different modes of adoption. So with that, I'd like to bring in Tony. Tony, you have been associated with the FAIR Institute. This institute has been pioneer in coming up with the VAR model for cyber risk. And actually, you have worked in much more advanced capabilities in terms of figuring out how we can really quantify cyber risk, right? So if you can share some of your thought process and how FAIR is actually, or otherwise any other quantification techniques which is available in the market, right? Where do we stand really in this space?
Sure. So I've built out quantitative risk programs at several companies, both large companies and small companies across several sectors. And I've had success with FAIR because it's purpose-built for information and operational risk. FAIR works really well with other frameworks like NIST, COBIT, ISO. And I found that you can take the FAIR risk analysis model and drop it right into any framework, any information security framework you might be using with little to no modifications. But having said that, you can really use any type of quantitative model that works for you within your company. I just happen to use FAIR because I found that it works really well. I've also found that organizations really are starting to move toward quantitative risk because they want to use the mountain of data that they have at their company to aid better decision making. So for example, red, yellow, green, or high, medium, low qualitative methods offers a ranked list. It shows you that risk number 1 is higher than risk number 2. So maybe we should prioritize risk number 1. Quantitative risk offers a much deeper understanding of the factors that make up risk and helps decision making. It goes beyond prioritization of risk 1 over risk 2. So at my current company, Netflix, the way we're using it is we're able to look inside risk and see the factors that make it up. Like risk number 1 has higher response costs. We have to hire a PR firm if this happens. Additional communications. We have to bring in a forensics company. Additional headcount. Those individual factors, and we can look and see where we want to influence risk or where we want to change or reduce, or maybe we're fine. Maybe we're okay with our level of risk. We're also using it for before and after comparisons. And this is a risk analysis type that I do all the time. Suppose you have a project that increases security controls. You can run 2 analyses and compare how controls influence risk measured in exposure. So you can see that your control project is reducing exposure by 50% for only, let's say, $1 million. And you would know that that's a good bet. But if the project costs more than the projected reduction in risk, then you know that's not a good bet. You need to go back to the drawing board and see if you can pick a different risk treatment option or perhaps accept the risk. So those are just a couple examples of how we're using it that goes beyond some of the capabilities of qualitative risk techniques.
Thanks a lot for that. I think that gives quite a good perspective in terms of how things are getting adopted in Netflix. Now, coming back to you, Joe. So, for example, when we talk about cyber risk quantification, or it may not be quantification, maybe the qualitative question and answer set we have, right? And when you're having this discussion with the board of directors or the security leaders, right? They definitely are asking a lot of questions in terms of the basis of how you're coming up with this high, medium, low versus some numbers, right? So, what are your recommendations for the organization? Where to start the cyber risk quantification journey?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the question is really, where do you have your biggest challenges, and how do you focus the organization on these challenges? And as you said, the board are starting to ask the right questions. And over my career, I've really noticed how the boards are getting more savvy in terms of challenging, let's say, the risk methodologies, challenging the risks you're putting out there, and asking questions like how many yellow risks are one red? I mean, and that's basically boiling down to the let's say the flaws of qualitative risk analysis, because you cannot really add them up or have these kinds of ROI discussions, how much risk we have reduced through the measures. And so I think the big challenge is really finding out when the organization is ready, and in which areas you can, let's say, you have enough resources, enough commitment from the company, and also support from the business to do qualitative risk analysis that actually then help your overall security program. Also showing, let's say, return on investment, showing how your actions are influencing the overall risk posture.
Excellent. And at MetricStream, we are actually taking almost a similar approach, right? Where we are trying to identify the risk scenarios and try to define the taxonomy of factors. We do not want to be, kind of giving a prescriptive solution for an organization. Rather, who is adopting the platform, they get a framework to work with, right? Which has enough flexibility, because this is like, if you're trying to solve this problem for every industry using one prescriptive way of doing it, I don't think that really helps anybody, right? In other words, coming up with that kind of a model, it's geared towards a particular organization is always, very helpful, right? And that's the, I guess, the flexibility you have in that, it gives you a lot of power in implementing any such model. So Ram, coming back to you, right? So we talked about, the challenges, and some of the companies are slowly adopting this, right? And try to understand what does quantification even mean in this context, right? Which is kind of very hard to get. Risk itself is a very loose term, and then when you try to quantify that risk, it gives you another different paradigm in terms of what do you mean by that quantification, that number, if you see, right? And we often talk about, the event frequency. We talk about expected loss, and we try to quantify that. Obviously, there's a lot of subjectivity out there. Sometimes it's an art rather than a science. But for an organization, right, in order to come up with a number, come up with a certain, even if it's a high, medium, low, right? What are the most important steps one should undertake to approach this kind of a problem domain?
Absolutely. So I will speak from healthcare perspective and what we are contemplating. So we are a $30 billion corporation, and we have tens of millions of records, patient records. So if you look back and see, if you look at Ponemon Institute, every year they conduct the cost of data breach. And when you look at the highest cost is assigned to if there is a breach of patient record, it comes to around $429, $430 or whatever per patient record. And there are so many factors in addition to providing credit coverage for a couple of years, potential lawsuits or fines and forensic and all kinds of investigation costs. So some of these breaches can even completely bring down the company. In fact, I'll give you an example. A couple of years back, there was a major breach with one of the billing companies in the healthcare industry. And they had roughly about 29 or 30 million patient records that got breached. And this company has been existing for years. And overnight, they filed for bankruptcy. And they support a lot of these labs, like in a LabCorp or all these big laboratories, they provide the support. So when you talk about how we are approaching and we are taking different things as part of how we do it. One is we have to make sure that the foundational controls are addressed. I think that there's no question about it when we talk about it, right? The second piece, when you look at it, we are looking at where are our crown jewels, right? When you look at an organization like CommonSpirit or a lot of healthcare companies, there are several systems that may store multiple hundreds of thousands of records and millions of records. So that's one population. So how do we make sure that we identify systems that are considered as crown jewels? If this system is compromised, we know that we will be in deep trouble, right? Not just from the breach perspective, but also from how it's going to be impacting the reputation and all kinds of things. So that's one part of it. The second is healthcare, and a lot of companies are moving more and more towards cloud and also sharing a lot of data with the external companies. So the footprint, if you look at 8-10 years back, 95% of the data was staying within the company. Now we are moving away from the data centers on-prem solutions to more of cloud, and more data is also getting shared with third-party companies. So the next big factor is you cannot just focus on only looking at our company and the risk factor. We have to look at out of, say, for example, hundreds or thousands of partners, business associates we have, which ones are critical and how effective their program is. And making sure that, okay, these are the top 10 or 20 companies. And if any of them are breached, then, again, it would have a significant impact to the operations and the cost and everything. So again, try to determine that. And then the third aspect is healthcare also is going through a lot of acquisitions. If you look at our company, I think, because of pandemic, in fact, this thing has even accelerated. So many small and medium systems, healthcare systems have been struggling a lot financially. So we are seeing a lot more consolidation happening. So we have to think about, when you go and acquire a system, a lot of times, many of these healthcare systems, they were already been compromised, right? Who knows? There may be, some kind of a threat actor. They may be already inside the network. So how do we make sure that you perform the right level of due diligence, right level of the risk quantification, and come back and tell the leadership where the risks are or what things we have to do before we really buy the system? Or even if we buy the system, what are the minimum things we do, so we create some strong baseline? So these are some of the things we have been contemplating. We are also trying to determine. So say, for example, how we can actually assign some kind of instead of just saying, hey, we have X Windows vulnerability, exploitable vulnerability, go ahead and address this. Trying to determine, okay, this vulnerability is exploited. What are the potential breach situations, or what is the potential dollars type of changes that could impact the organization? We're trying to get into that kind of a mode, at least for critical systems, to create a level of awareness for the leadership. So we are hoping, I think, that would definitely change. But I agree with Tony. I think ultimately, I completely understand. I think that kind of a model we should evolve to. But it's a question of, when I look at the healthcare industries, how we are struggling from the resources perspective. I think it's a journey. How they actually take it from different stages in terms of when they get to risk quantification.
Thank you, Ram. So coming to James, back to you again, James. Sorry, put you on the spot. So just imagine that we are in the world where we have been able to quantify the cyber risk for a given organization, right? Now the question is, well, you use sophisticated methods, you've done the modeling techniques to come up with an answer. Now, what are the common questions you're trying to answer when you're trying to present this to the senior executives that, well, what are the aspects that really draws their attention, if you will, when we are presenting this kind of an modeling technique with certain outputs, which is much more quantifiable rather than being subjective?
Yeah, sure. So I guess from my experience, and I in KPMG, I focus on financial services clients, and it would be interesting to hear from my fellow panelists whether these questions change across industry. But the questions that I guess I commonly come back to in the output support answering is so probably something around where should cybersecurity functions, CISOs, focus their investment to sort of realize the biggest bang for buck in terms of risk reduction, and to be able to do that with more structure and I guess a more demonstrable sort of approach of how you've sort of deconstructed that problem. I think historically we've primarily relied on expertise of a CISO, which and their reports, which is absolutely the primary and the right source of intelligence, but being able to show, and I come back to this decision support element, being able to deconstruct a scenario, whether it's ransomware, show that you've really understood it and how different cyber capabilities play into that scenario at helping to mitigate it, and having the outputs then support that expert judgment, or in some ways refine it, is really useful. I think a second, and we've touched on this a bit already, is where can I expect cost savings as a result of fewer cyber losses, despite me spending potentially more on my cyber capabilities. So broadly across financial services over the last few years, I've seen sort of big budgets, and still big budgets relatively, but definitely cost pressures, and more CISOs and their team and change directors are having to justify the spend. And optimize the spend. So that's another key question. I think linked to that, from that change director's perspective, is their portfolio focused on the right things? Another question, and this is a harder one to answer, and it can often be hard because of culture and the language that people are used to speaking. But a question I sometimes get is, how can I use CRQ to better articulate my organization's exposure in the context of our risk appetite? And that's a trickier question to answer.
Okay, thanks, James, for that. So changing a little bit of a topic here and coming to you, Tony, you have been working in Netflix. And Netflix, as we know, right, it deals with a lot of customer-sensitive data. So in how are you basically utilizing the CRQ methods to create a risk awareness within the organization? And also, does Netflix value the point that whether we should have a single dollar value for any kind of cyber risk exposure?
Yeah, so we're using the risk management program in general to drive better decision making. Everything we do is connected back to business objectives. We're using our risk management program to understand our return on investment for security controls or security projects. We're running cost benefit analysis to see if we actually should implement security project A or security project B. Another thing that we're using it for is helping people understand opportunity cost. For every dollar you spend on a security project, that presumably takes a dollar away from somewhere else in the business. So we're trying to help people understand if they should invest in security or somewhere else. everything ties back to overall business objectives and decision making instead of risk just being a byproduct of just an activity that you're undertaking. And to answer the second part of your question, we do have that single number of risk exposure, but I caution people that ask for that at my company that it represents risk exposure. Risk is a forecast. So let's take an insurance company as an example. An insurance company, let's say they insure 10 houses at $1 million each, and the insurance is against hurricanes. So one could say that their total exposure is $10 million. And that doesn't mean that they're going to lose $10 million in the next hurricane. It doesn't mean they're going to lose anything. The hurricane could just totally bypass that area or damage a couple houses, or it could damage all the houses. So your total losses could be 0 or 10 million or any range in between. Risk is always a range of possibilities. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. And that's where cyber risk quantification really shines. We're able to articulate our uncertainty around the forecast instead of presenting something that kind of resembles a crystal ball, like this is high risk. And that number, that single number, is useful for understanding our overall total exposure. But I found for decisions, we really need to dig in and decompose that a little bit deeper to make specific decisions around investments.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Any comments on that from other panelists, if you want to see if that kind of a method or approach makes sense for your areas?
I have a more generic question, Joe, if I may ask Tony. Tony, I mean, when you talk about this FAIR or any risk quantification that you've been doing, a couple of questions. One is, how long Netflix has been doing this, and how many resources have been assigned to focus on this risk quantification effort?
I'm really lucky in the sense that I work for a company that's very quantitatively minded. And I know that the culture struggle is real. At a lot of companies I've worked at, it's hard to get people into the mindset of thinking about things in terms of exposure or a range of possibilities instead of a single adjective or a color that makes it very easy to make decisions. We need to make this red, a yellow, let's invest there. And I'm lucky that we just never really had that struggle. And I think, we might be unique in that sense, or very few companies actually have that, where people demand that from me. I never had to come in and sell it. It was the exact opposite. People demanded that when I came in. There's already strong risk quantification across many aspects of the company, including information security. And I don't have a good answer for the headcount number, the resource number, because there is a risk management team, but a lot of the risk quantification really is deputized across many aspects of the information security team and the company as a whole, because we just employ a lot of modelers, statisticians, that type of thing.
Okay, thank you, Tony.
Cool. So just a little bit changing the topic here, but in the same direction. So if you go into an organization who is fairly new in terms of any kind of quantification methodology, right? And we know for cybersecurity, there's a whole concepts of threats, vulnerabilities. We talk about assets. We talk about risk, right? And everything needs to come together at a certain point of time, right? So, and also the control framework, if you will, right? So is it that in your experience, and I'm opening up to all the panelists here, in your experience, for an organization of a medium size, right, would you start with inventorying your assets and identifying what the critical assets are, or would you start from what are the threats and do the threat modeling first, and then get to a concept of, okay, so what are the controls relevant to those threat models or threats or high-risk threats, and then try to actually approach that from a risk assessment point of view, if you will, right? There can be many approaches. I mean, you can also start from a high level, do a top-down approach, starting with the risk, definition of risk, and how do you break down the risk, right, in different categories. So I'm sure that you have seen different flavors in different industries. So I just wanted to get what are those flavors which today are in practice or in motion?
I actually don't start with either of those. So James had mentioned earlier about boiling the ocean. And I've found that if you try, this is just my experience, that if you try to run risk quantification on all of your assets or all the threats and vectors and methods, you will never finish, and it's difficult to do. What I do is I ask people, what are the decisions you're trying to make? What are those burning decisions that you have? And then I run risk quantification on those. So instead of trying to figure out all the different ways that a data breach can happen across our assets, maybe the only question we really have around data breaches is, are we covered from an insurance perspective, or do we have enough capital reserve? And then I run the quantitative risk analysis on that. Maybe we have some M&A activity that's coming up that's much more important than a ransomware risk assessment because we already have controls over there. So I focus on the M&A activity. So I just try to really tie everything to decisions, business objectives, and where the company is trying to optimize. And that's where I focus my activities.
Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, sorry, Joy.
I was just.
I like Tony, what you mentioned. Sorry, James, you wanted to say something?
Go for it. You go.
Okay. No, I think the point is very valid. People sometimes get confused with the risks and vulnerabilities, and that itself is a challenge, Tony and James and Joe, right? I think when you look at it, a lot of companies are kind of in the weeds. So looking at what are the top 3 or top 5 risks that could cause huge breach for the organization, or kind of ransomware type of an attack, or cause some systems to go down, or looking at the partners, what are the top 3, top 5, top 10 partners. So we may have to start with that kind of a high risk or risk based approach. But the challenge is when it comes to the assets and threats, what you outlined, Joe, it is important. When you look at an organization like in ours, that exercise should be going on. It's more of a strategic exercise so that you have a good understanding of all the assets that you have, because an organization like healthcare generally is not like for example Netflix or some of the newer companies. There may be different gateways and in how the industry itself is set up. Some of these small devices, like for example medical devices, could become a threat vector for you. Somebody could get into your network using some vulnerabilities in the medical devices, and then they can kind of go inside the network. So I think it depends upon the industry, but I think the whole understanding of the assets, or the critical risks, critical partners, that exercise should definitely happen.
Sure. And I think James, you were trying to say something before, and we have few questions from the audience, so we'll switch to the audience questions after this. Please go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to add that I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think it's absolutely imperative that you understand your critical assets. But I also think that if you can afford the resource and you've got a large enough risk management function, then you should spend the time understanding your risks. And I use that word quite specifically, because I work with a lot of clients where we go in and initially they might be talking about risks around, or they might define their risks as asset management or insider threat, and it's that distinguishing between what's a threat actor, what's a control or a capability, and what is actually a risk that could result in a loss. So I try and encourage our clients to think about ransomware as a risk, a large-scale data breach or an accidental data disclosure through someone sending an email to the wrong participant. So I think the framing of the problem, and spending some time thinking through, okay, what's the lens that we want to communicate our cyber risk quantification efforts through, or even just qualitative risk assessment efforts through. It doesn't have to be a CRQ conversation. It's fundamental. That conversation about how we frame it is really, really important up front. And that's why I think the scenario-led approach is a popular one, because it allows you to do that, and you can align to organizational frameworks, enterprise risk management taxonomies, which is another really important point, I think, to align with the language that the wider organization speaks and that the different lines of defense speak. A mistake I think that's commonly made is just to make CRQ a technology or cybersecurity driven initiative, and it's not. It should be sponsored and driven by multiple stakeholders who understand the benefits that it can deliver. And if you can't understand the benefits up front, you're probably doing something wrong. And it's time to sort of reassess and re-steer perhaps where you're putting your efforts.
Thank you, James. That's very helpful, and I believe we have some questions from our audiences. Okay, so the first question, here it comes. So the question is, what are the benefits of using a framework that support custom quantification models? Anyone want to take it?
Maybe Tony would be better.
Sorry?
No, Tony, I think follows methodology framework. So Tony, you may have some comments there.
Yeah.
Sure, I can take this one. So most frameworks that are out there, NIST, COBIT, ISO, ISACA's Risk IT framework, it builds a framework and umbrella around managing the entire life cycle of risk. And the risk model that you use is just a tiny component of that. And even though I advocate for FAIR and I've used FAIR, in many cases, I don't think that we were meant to use one model. I think of risk models as many books on a bookshelf, that you pick one that fits the decision that you have. And frameworks do support this. So I think risk management frameworks are more around managing the entire life cycle of risk. And as long as you have certain components in your risk model, like threat identification, asset identification, vulnerability, understanding all the factors that make up magnitude, you can use custom models, you can use FAIR, you can use something else, you can use a qualitative model and fit that in. I think that when you're implementing a quantitative risk model, you can take baby steps. You can move yourself slowly away from qualitative over to quantitative, use components of each, just add rigor to your program over time. And then you'll find yourself over time with a much more mature model.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I think we are running out of time. So thank you, Joe, Ram, Tony, and James for taking the time and making this much more insightful, and hope to see you again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.